Welcome back. So now we have looked at entropy, we looked at limits, thermodynamic limits and how they result from entropy. We looked at what is life, Schrödinger's definition. And now we want to look at, what's actually limiting life. So what's limiting the dissipative activity of the biosphere? And what I'm going to do here in this video is only a subset of the biosphere, which is the terrestrial biosphere, so the plants on land. I will leave out the ocean, but the ocean or the marine biosphere is also not as active as the terrestrial biosphere on land. Now, we've already seen that the process that generates the energy that is available to life is generated by photosynthesis. So that's, if you want, photosynthesis is sort of the process that how plants power the biosphere. It's the power plant of the biosphere. That's why I show here that picture of the power plant. And what this process does is it takes CO2 and water, uses light as an energy source, and produces carbohydrates and oxygen out of it. So these are the products. And well, we now want to understand what's actually limiting that process. There's actually a long history of evaluating the efficiency of photosynthesis, and I want to sort of briefly touch upon this first. So we have solar radiation coming in, so it's a flux of photons, of packets of energy. The wavelengths that photosynthesis uses are somewhere in the near infrared. The photons have an energy of about 1.8 electron volts. That are used in photosynthesis in the photosystems to split, in the end, to split water and then to separate the proton from the electron. And we can make a quick calculation there. So photosynthesis, to fix one molecule of CO2, photosynthesis requires 8 to 10 photons. It's called the quantum yield efficiency. When we multiply it by the 1.8 electron volt, that's an energy unit in the quantum world, then we get about 14 to 18 electron volts. And well, what I find quite amazing is when you compare that to sort of calculations from quantum physics in terms of how much energy do you need to split the hydrogen, to separate the electron from the proton in the hydrogen atom. There you need about 14 electron volts. And well, I mean, I think that looks like that photosynthesis is actually quite efficient in separating the proton from the electron, because it uses a little more than these 13.6. It uses about 14 to 18 electron volts. When we convert this to a mole basis, then we get about 1.4 megajoules per mole of carbon being fixed. So this is, when we add CO2 and water to photosynthesis, then, we get the carbohydrates, and then we can look up how much energy is in glucose, and that's about 480 kilojoules, or 0.48 megajoules per mole carbon. To derive an efficiency from that, well, we need to, the very typical calculation, we need to evaluate the energy that comes out in relation to the energy comes in. So that yields us an efficiency. And what we get is, well, we divide the 0.48 megajoules and that's stored in the glucose and divided by the 1.4 megajoules, and we get an efficiency of about 34%. Well, if we then also consider that photosynthesis doesn't use the whole spectrum of solar radiation, but only reddish and bluish colors, that's why it's green, because the green is not used. So it only uses a fraction. It's called the photosynthetically active radiation. That's about half of the solar spectrum. Then we get an efficiency of about 17%, and that's a decent efficiency. But when we look at the real world and we take data sets, both satellite-based data sets on absorption of solar radiation at the surface, and we take satellite-derived data set on carbon uptake by the biosphere by photosynthesis, we get this map that shows that the efficiency of photosynthesis on land is typically less than 3%, when the typical value is actually more like 1 or 2%. So that looks pretty inefficient, and that has been a long question in the science of photosynthesis, why the efficiency is so damn low. Well, actually, a simple explanation comes from when we actually look at what ecosystems actually do in relation to their environment. So let's look a little closer. So here is a schematic diagram of a leaf. We have the input of solar energy in terms of the photons. They are absorbed by the so-called photosystems. That's where water is being split. You get the proton does one thing, the electron is put somewhere else. Then we have this little machinery called ATP synthase that produces energy in form of ATP. That's a chemical compound, adenyl triphosphate. That's sort of the energy carrier for cells. And in the end, that drives the Calvin cycle. That's on the right. That's the part which is called the dark reactions of photosynthesis, where CO2 is incorporated and sugar is being produced. So that's the output on the right. But what the plant actually needs to do is it needs to take up CO2 from the surrounding air, so it gets into the leaf and can be used in the Calvin cycle. And in doing so, it loses water. That happens through little openings in the leaves. They're called stomates, and the process is called gas exchange. So basically what plants do is they take up CO2, lose water. It's like a trading game. And they actually require a lot of water for this, much more than in the photosynthetic reaction. And just to give you numbers here, so when you fix 1 gram of carbon in photosynthesis, you know the stoichiometry of the equation is so that 1 CO2 and 1 water gives you 1 CH2O, so it's equal. But when you look at the gas exchange, typical values are that when you take up 1 gram of carbon, that requires actually half a kilogram of water, or that's associated with half a kilogram of water lost through the stomate. And so that's actually the bottleneck. So just to show how closely photosynthesis aligns with evaporation, that's what's shown here. So on the top right, we see this map from 2 slides ago of the photosynthetic efficiency. Below, we see a satellite empirically derived data set on actual evaporation. And when we plot photosynthetic rate and evaporation against each other for all the grid points that are shown, then we see that the relationship is really, really close. It's a very tight relationship. So the loss of water and the photosynthetic rate are very tightly linked in these terrestrial ecosystems. On the other hand, we have seen in the previous videos that the rate of evaporation and the rate of vertical exchange, that's thermodynamically limited. So when we compare this evaporation rate that is derived from satellite data and empirical approaches, and we relate it to the evaporation rate that you get from thermodynamics, then we actually see that they are also very closely related. So that leads to the interpretation that thermodynamics indeed limits photosynthesis, but it's in a much more indirect way. It is because it limits turbulent fluxes via this limit of maximum power. And then this partitioning between these turbulent fluxes, so that's the result of motion. Part of this is just buoyancy, so that's uprising air, and along with it goes water, and the most water that can be transported in the form of vapor is described by a concept called equilibrium partitioning. Basically, what this means is that you can't transport more water from the surface into the atmosphere than saturated water, and that leads to this equilibrium partitioning, and that leads to this estimate that's shown here. And so the interpretation now is that thermodynamics limits this gas exchange, and that limits photosynthesis. So when we go back to this picture of the biosphere, then actually it's not the solar radiation and the conversion into chemical free energy that's the bottleneck, but it is the transport of the materials that photosynthesis requires to be able to do photosynthesis and generate this disequilibrium. Now, and I think that's actually quite plausible when you think about this gas exchange. When you think about these very complex canopies that you see in a rainforest, what do? Well, they maximize the area, the contact area with the atmosphere to maximize that gas exchange. Well, but now it seems like that this transport and these constraints, they are all set by thermodynamics. And, it almost seems like the biosphere is hopeless, and it's not. And this is sort of the next step I want to take and saying, well, actually the biosphere is able to push limits. And I want to actually get back to that rainforest and demonstrate this, because we have seen this picture here before when we talked about limits. So this is the typical diurnal course of the energy partitioning of over a rainforest. And what we see is how much solar radiation comes in. That's the red line marked RS. And we also see how much evaporation takes place, the blue line labeled LE for latent, the latent heat flux, L times the evaporation rate. So, and it seems when you look at this picture that all is determined by thermodynamics, but not quite, because that rainforest is in a seasonal climate. And what it means is seasonal climate, well, part of the year you get too much rain, so you get more rain than you can evaporate. And another part of the year, you don't get enough rain to maintain evaporation. Well, and there the forest actually does its thing. It has roots, it has the ability to explore the soil volume below and extract that water that is not accessible by purely physical means, but rather by providing a plumbing network. The root systems as a plumbing network to extract that water from the soil. And so let's put that in a schematic diagram. So here what I show is the seasonality. So we have a wet phase where precipitation is larger than how much water could evaporate. The technical term for this is potential evaporation, here in light red. But if you don't have storage, then your actual evaporation rate, EACT, is just, well, either limited by potential evaporation during this humid period where there is plenty of rainfall. But then if water gets limiting, then at best, the actual evaporation just follows the precipitation in terms of the available water. Now, what root systems can accomplish is that they can store the excess water from the rainy season and use it during the dry season. So root systems allow this access to soil moisture, and with that, they can evaporate more in the dry season, and by that, they can actually maintain more gas exchange and achieve a higher productivity. And a simple estimate for that would be that actually the productivity is enhanced by about 12%. And I think that's a nice case for how the limits imposed by thermodynamics can be pushed, can be altered to make the environment or to make the conditions that life is exposed to actually to make it more productive. Another example, what actually the biosphere can do is it can optimize its functioning. And that brings me to this diagram here, or these two pictures. And it's a very nice topic that I could talk for quite a while. It has to do with structure formation. And the structure formation is something that you see in many systems. For example, on the left is a very small drainage network that formed after intense rainfall shower on the beach. On the left, you can see my feet. And you see how such a fractal drainage network forms very quickly. On the right, I show you a plant leaf, and that's essentially also such a fractal network where you have small veins feeding into bigger veins, and the bigger veins go into eventually in the branches. And so you have these fractal networks, and there was beautiful work in the late 90s by colleagues from the Santa Fe Institute around Jeffrey West and Brian Enquist and others that showed mathematically that these fractal networks actually act to minimize frictional dissipation. inside the vessels. So in other words, when you have a certain gradient that allows the water to move up to the canopy and there being evaporated, when you minimize your frictional dissipation, then you can transport the most mass. So it's another way to optimize the functioning and pushing the limits, the transport limits that the biosphere is exposed to. So conceptually, let's look at this more in an Earth system context. So we have solar radiation providing the radiative forcing that drives those heat engines and shapes the environment, and that's associated with resources and transport that limit the biosphere. Then the biosphere can optimize its transport and become more efficient. It can achieve more, it can enhance the access to resources in transport. I gave the example of the deep roots or the rooting systems in the soils that enhance the access to water, but also to other nutrients. What I haven't talked about here is the role of animals as part of the biosphere, part of the consumers, because what animals actually do is, actually two really big effects. One is that they provide a digestive system, so they provide a very comfortable environment for doing the decomposition of materials to release back the nutrients. And the other really big effect is that they can transport nutrients against physical gradients, meaning that animals can walk uphill. And quite often they do. So there are complex food webs, like in the Amazon, where fish breed in the delta, then they migrate upward into the small creeks. There they're being eaten by, for example, sea otters or fish otters. And these fish otters, they prey on the river and the fish, and they live on land. So they carry the nutrients back on land, and then there are ants and birds and all kinds of animals that transport the nutrients back against the physical gradients and feed the biosphere with nutrients. And then at the really larger scale of things, what the biosphere can also do is can alter the radiative forcing of the whole planet. And this is something that we will see when we get to the next part where we talk about the Earth's history. Because the biosphere deals with CO2, it can actually change the atmospheric composition, and it can change the radiatively active components in the atmosphere, and by that it can alter the conditions of the heat engines, and so it can change the whole planetary climate. But I'll leave that for the next video. So let's summarize this. So what limits life? Well, what limits life? Well, we've seen photosynthesis powers the biosphere, metabolism's dissipated, and what's limiting photosynthesis then also limits how much can be dissipated by metabolisms. We've seen that photosynthesis on land is limited by gas exchange, not by light, not directly by thermodynamics, but the gas exchange is independently, sort of indirectly limited by thermodynamics. And we have seen sort of cases where the biosphere is able to push the limits to enhance its metabolic activities and enhances the generation and dissipation of its activity. And so before I end this video, I want to sort of quickly go back to this diagram that we had in the beginning about this relationship between entropy, Earth, and life. What we see is that entropy, well, it sets directions and limits for life, but sort of really more indirectly, because what it really does is it sets directions and limits for Earth system processes. They set transport limits to life, and life is then able to change and push these limits to create an environment that is more able to support more activity of the biosphere. And we will see more of this in the next video when we talk about the Earth's history.